People sometimes ask me what my first memory is. Invariably I lie, because I'm prone to avoid the explanation that comes with the truth. Maybe, from now on, if someone casually asks me what is your first memory, I will reach into my bag where there will be copies of this story and I will just hand one over. As they read it, their face will morph from confusion, into the furrowed brow of concern, and finally into the drop-jawed bewilderment that accompanies real fear. In passing, I tell people that my first memory was of me standing on a stool in front of my kitchen window. It was just after dusk in winter and from where I stood, I could make out the black limbs of the skeletal beech tree that loomed from across the driveway. While that is indeed a real memory, it's not the first one. If you want to hear about that, here it is. There was an unfortunate series of incidences that happened in the town where I grew up during the summer of 1989. By incidences, I mean murders. I'm not talking about your run-of-the-mill bar brawl gone too far or an act of passionate revenge. No. The events that happened in Middleton were far more grotesque. Even more so because the victims were children. I don't remember the heat wave that had swept Middleton that summer, the pink droplets of melted ice cream on the simmering pavement, or old men reclined in overstuffed chairs in shady living rooms. These precious details were told to me through family members and friends of my parents. They all, to this day, say that it was the hottest summer they have ever lived through. To make the weather even more unbearable, there were weekly brownouts that year due to some oversights at the electric plant in Salem. As a result, homes and businesses would go for hours at a time without air conditioning. Popsicles were promptly sold out in every business afternoon. Magazines and newspapers weren't read that summer, they were bought to be used as makeshift fans. It seemed that the only place where air conditioning still remained during these outages was the car. I've been told by relatives that it was not uncommon during that summer to find neighbors lounging back in their parked cars with the windows up, drinking a beer and listening to the radio. At times it was the only escape from the unbearable humidity and heat. That's why, when mothers would go shopping, it became impossible to pull their children from their cars. After all, the kids knew that the inside of whatever clothing or grocery store their mother had taken them to was probably as hot if not hotter than the parking lot. The coolest and best place to be was in the car, with the windows rolled up and that gentle whispering wind seeping through the vents. With this setting in mind, you can understand how Mr. Teeth, as he was later called by newspapers, had his pick of the litter, so to speak. He knew that in any given lot outside of a busy grocery or department store, there would be at least 2 or 3 cars where the children had been left inside. One such car was parked outside of the Market Basket on the afternoon of June 3rd. Within sat Jeremy Hager, a freckled 8-year-old with a penchant for action figures. When Jeremy's mother returned from her quick dash for butter, she found the back right door of the vehicle ajar, a Darth Vader doll left abandoned on the back seat. News of the disappearance radiated through the town over the following week up until the day when a jogger noticed a small black Reebok laying in the grass on the edge of the reservoir. Not long afterward, Jeremy's body was pulled from the brown water and sent to the morgue. It was there that doctors noted what appeared to be bite marks on the boy's arms and neck. Victim number 2 was Amanda DeMiller, a girl of 7 who had fallen asleep on her way home from shopping with her mother on July 18th. As was common in those days, a parent might leave their sleeping child in the car once at home. Britta DeMiller, Amanda's mother, later told police that with the house being as hot as it was, she had thought that Amanda would sleep better in the car with the sliding side door left open. At some point Mrs. DeMiller looked out the window to see that Amanda was no longer in her seat. The family lived on a fairly wooded road leading into the forests of Middleton. Neighbors were widely separated from one another. Mr. and Mrs. DeMiller spent all of that night scouring the narrow back roads, knocking on the doors of the occasional houses. After only a 3-day search, a local boy found Amanda's body slumped in the corner of his treehouse. Her throat was purple from strangulation and covered with bite marks. Her shoes were on the wrong feet. Anyway, that's how the story goes. That brings us to my first memory. My parents have since placed the date of this memory to around the 3rd or 4th week of August. It had been about a month since Amanda DeMiller's murder, but no one had been apprehended. People in town were still on edge. It was at that time, one afternoon, when I sat in the front seat of my mom's rusty Toyota parked in the giant lot of Henry's grocery store. I remember that there was a car parked on either side of my mother's, and in front of the Toyota was one of those corrals for shopping carts. There was music playing quietly on the radio, Madonna maybe, and my hands were sticky from eating candy. You may wonder how, with all of the horrors that had plagued Middleton that summer, my mother could have left me alone in the car. The fact is, she hadn't. My older brother, Stephen, age 12 at the time, had been designated as my temporary guardian while she made an emergency stop for flour. It was this temporary guardian who decided that this was the perfect opportunity to run to the bookstore nearby to buy a deck of collectible cards. Before he dashed out of the back seat, I remember him saying something like, "Don't go anywhere." So there I sat, waiting for one or both of my family members to return. It was then that I saw him, and it's this part which is clear even to this day. The halogen lamps had just come on all across the lot. They cast that greenish glow from just being turned on. The sky beyond the pines that bordered the market was streaked with pink and purple. It must have been around 7:30. I remember first seeing him, standing there some 30 feet from the front of our car. Almost instantly, the music from the radio faded from my ears along with the sharp rattle of carriage wheels on the old pavement. Transfixed, silent, I stared out the windshield at this lanky gaunt figure framed by pink and purple sky. Through a curtain of greasy black hair falling across his brow, I discerned a single eye. It seemed to sort of take on the green glow of those halogen lights. He tilted his head back a bit and the hint of a smile danced across his thin lips. He must have stood and stared through the windshield at me, transfixed and spellbound as I was, for one whole minute. He then started a slow walk over to my side of the car, never taking his eye from mine. Once he was outside my door, he looked down his long beak-like nose at me. Then looking around, he began to wiggle the handle. "Open up," he said, looking down at me again. I just stared at him without saying anything. Again, "Open up." His long skeletal fingers left the door handle and started to dance across my window, tapping here and there. He crouched down so that he was at my level and started a sort of puppet show with his hands. His dirty fingers dashed across the glass like great pale spiders in a deadly battle. He looked at them and laughed, making hissing and growling sounds. As he made these sounds, his mouth opened up into a full grin, and I had a look inside, at rows of long yellow teeth. They are, to this day, the longest and largest teeth I've ever seen. There were gaps between them, and they reminded me vaguely of dirty piano keys. He seemed to be completely immersed in his spider battle, giggling and clawing at each of his hands. At one point, he noticed that my window was open just a crack at the top. He looked at me grinning with those mighty teeth and crawled one of his hand spiders up to the space. I was openly sobbing at this point. He managed to squeeze the tips of 4 fingers through the opening. I caught a greasy whiff of unwashed clothes mingled with the sweet scent of blood. "Come on. Open up," he said, in a whiny, pleading voice. "Open up." He said this same sentence in a dozen different voices, from a girly voice to a thick lumberjack one. By sheer luck, the woman who was parked on the passenger side of our car, returned with all 4 of her noisy kids in tow. Upon seeing her, the man scurried off in a ducked walk towards the cart corral, where he smoothly stood up straight and walked off into the parking lot. But not before looking over his shoulder, gnashing those massive teeth, and catching me with one final blood-chilling stare. The memory ends there. It was later explained to me that my brother had returned to the car to find me crying hysterically. No matter what he said to calm me through the glass, apparently, I wouldn't unlock the doors. My mother returned soon after. She said that all I could manage to say through thick sobs was, "There was a man." I just kept repeating it for hours after that. There was a man. Like the insufferable heat, so too did the Middleton murders come to an end with the changing of the seasons. Just 2 weeks after my parking lot encounter, the child killer, who was later identified as Raymond Sandler, age 29, was caught after taking a young girl from a birthday party at a roller rink in Beverly. A worker on his coffee break at the adjacent gas station saw a thin man lead the girl out the back door of the rink and attempt to force her into a red car. The worker called the cops and the car was pulled over on Route 128 just outside of Gloucester. While I don't remember it, I first made the connection between the man in the parking lot and Mr. Teeth by seeing my father's newspaper on the coffee table the day after Sandler's capture. There, in a large blown-up black and white, was the same ghastly face I'd seen just inches from mine with only a layer of glass separating us. Apparently, I didn't make it to school the day I saw the newspaper on account of I couldn't stop screaming. Knowing that I had almost been a victim myself, my family and people around Middleton weren't willing to tell me anything about the killer once I grew curious, years later. I suppose they didn't want to freak me out more than I already was. So, in high school, I did some of my own research. I learned that the Boston Globe had first coined the nickname Mr. Teeth both on account of Sandler's unusually large incisors and his habit of biting the skin of his victims. His means of killing was almost exclusively strangulation. Due to his being diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, Sandler was often delusional. As a result, his story regularly changed. However, after being asked several times, the number of murders he confessed to, while varying, never went above 10. It was also noted in research on Sandler that he only hunted in the summertime. Some speculated that this was because of the easy access to children who had been left in cool cars while their parents went in to shop. Others suggested that the hot weather triggered something inside of Sandler, something that lay dormant during the fall and winter, then awoke once the temperature hit 80. Who can say? The years have softened that first memory a bit. I'm almost 40 now and, while that hideous grin isn't quite as distinct as it used to be, I still see it sometimes when I wake up at night, usually in the warmer months. Someday, one of my two girls, who know nothing of the summer of '89, may ask when they're older, "Hey, Dad? What's your first memory?" Maybe I'll tell them about the time I was on the stool in my kitchen looking out at the old beech tree. Or maybe I'll just say, "Teeth. I remember teeth." Credit to Daniel Du Bois. Credit to Daniel Du Bois. With his new bride in his arms, Gavin stepped across the threshold of their new home. He set her down carefully on her feet and steadied her balance. Between her puffy wedding gown, the 3-inch heels she wore, and all the champagne she had drunk, Gavin figured his new wife could use his support. She smiled brightly despite being tipsy and marveled at the exquisite foyer. "Darling!" exclaimed Victoria. "This had to cost you a fortune." As Victoria stepped deeper into the foyer and admired the marble floors, high ceilings, and rich mahogany furniture accents, Gavin loosened his bow tie and congratulated himself on finally making it. For a man in his early 40s, Gavin had been through several hardships. He had been raised on welfare and never knew his father. His brother had died in a drug overdose when Gavin was in high school. And, most disturbing, his mother had disappeared when Gavin was in college and was never found. It had been difficult finding a bank that would grant him a loan to attend college, but when one did, Gavin made the most of it. He had studied hard, rose to the top of his class, and earned a prestigious internship at one of Connecticut's top law firms upon graduating and never looked back. But in all his years of success, he never dreamed he'd fall in love with a woman as beautiful as Victoria. Like other love stories, he had met her at a coffee shop. It was a mom-and-pop establishment in the heart of Bridgeport. Gavin had always loved small cafes and had been growing annoyed with the bad attitudes of the baristas he usually encountered from others. So when he drove along Water Street and saw a new place, he all but slammed on the brakes. Victoria had been setting out fresh pastries when Gavin stepped in. She immediately caught his eye. Her black hair cascaded down in loose tendrils, falling sensuously on her shoulders and chest. Its hue contrasted her milky tan skin so dramatically that to Gavin it was purely stunning. He had asked her to dinner right then and there. She had said no. In fact, Victoria had said no to Gavin more times than he could count, but he had to have her. He kept showing up at the coffee shop, kept asking, and eventually she said yes. This made Victoria his most prized possession. Not that she was a possession, but in terms of all the things Gavin had wanted, worked hard for, and received, this woman was by far the most important. So it gave him great joy to watch as Victoria fell in love with this house. As she strolled through the 15,000 square foot mansion, Gavin followed her and smiled to himself. It greatly pleased him that the realtor closed escrow just in time for the wedding. The realtor had been stalling for mysterious reasons, and when Gavin finally pressed using a sharp tone in his voice, the realtor mentioned some kind of problem with the house regarding a mishap with the prior occupants. "There may be hazards," were his exact words, but Gavin had found it completely ridiculous and threw his attorney contacts into the situation. The realtor had drawn the papers up within an hour. That's how Gavin got things done, and he was glad that's how he did. From the center of the master bedroom, Victoria turned around and around, arms stretched out like a joyful little girl. Gavin laughed, sharing in her joy. She ran to the bed and hopped on it. The smile on her face ran from ear to ear. She ran to her vanity desk, and opened the drawers. All of her favorite brands of makeup were already stocked inside. She looked at herself in the mirror smiling for joy, and then she looked at Gavin's reflection. "It's a dream. It has to be. I love it," said Victoria, and she popped open a small container of Chanel blush. She plucked a brush out from a side drawer and began to paint her cheeks. Her most treasured shade, apricot. Gavin embraced her from behind and kissed her neck. He then lifted her in his arms and carried her to the bed. "Wait." She chuckled out, "Let me put my makeup back." As he laid her down, he whispered, "You're the love of my life, I'd do anything for you." That night they made love more passionately than either thought possible. But in the weeks to come, Victoria became consumed by her boredom. Ever since Gavin had proposed, he'd insisted she not toil away at the coffee shop. She was the significant other to a high-powered attorney. He stated that there was no reason to degrade herself by serving coffee. Most nights Gavin would get home around 10 p.m. with little energy to do much besides watch the evening news and turn in, but Victoria seemed so dissatisfied by that. She complained to Gavin that he didn't have time for her, and when he wouldn't listen she went on about how the house was playing tricks on her. When she placed an item down, she'd say, it was gone by the time she returned to it. She wanted his company and she wanted to go out. "There's a new restaurant that opened downtown," she often said, implying that she'd like to go, but Gavin brushed it off, apologizing that he had an important deposition in the morning. "I loved my life before you, Gavin," she revealed to him one night before bed. "Don't give me a reason to go back to it." Gavin lowered his reading glasses to question her, but Victoria had already turned off the light. The next morning Gavin woke up and found Victoria's side of the bed was cold. He rose and went downstairs for coffee. Unlike every morning since they'd moved in, there was no coffee in the pot, and Victoria was not in the kitchen. A sharp pang of guilt hit Gavin. He should have listened to her and taken her out. Why can't she understand their livelihood depends on his long hours? Assuming his wife was off sulking in the living room, he went there, but it was empty. He walked briskly to the exercise room, but she wasn't there. He checked the library, billiards room, study, and finally the laundry room and secondary bathrooms, but his wife was nowhere to be found. Gavin contemplated taking the day off from work when he realized his favorite mug was not on the third shelf of the cupboard like it should have been. He opened the adjacent cupboard door, but his mug wasn't there either. Gavin quickly threw open all the cupboards in the kitchen, and then the dishwasher before he finally accepted that his mug was not in this kitchen. He was dumbstruck. Hours later the police were swarming about his apartment. Gavin sat on the couch and thanked the lead detective. "We really shouldn't consider this a missing person case until 72 hours, said Crosby, who was the lead detective. "I'm aware, I really appreciate it," said Gavin, not fully meaning it. His law firm had represented a number of crooked cops in Crosby's department and Gavin felt they owed him, and owed him big. "When did you last see Victoria?" he asked. "Last night," answered Gavin. You don't understand. It's not like Victoria to go anywhere without my knowledge. She left her purse with all her cards and her ID, and even keys. I'm worried. Can you think of any place she might have gone? Gavin racked his brain, and then he began to shake his head when something caught his eye. It would have been overlooked by anyone else, but to Gavin it was alarming. On the marble floor not 10 feet from the couch where he sat was a small pile of powder. "What?" asked it. Crosby, but Gavin didn't answer. He rose out of his seat and knelt down. He placed his index finger into the powder. "What is it?" "That?" Crosby asked again. "It's rouge," said Gavin. "Rouge?" The detective rose an eyebrow. "My wife's makeup." "Her blush?" "What she wore on her cheeks," answered Gavin as he rubbed the apricot powder between his fingers. Some of the officers exchanged glances and snickered, which Gavin noticed. "You think this is funny? My wife is missing." "That?" Crosby closed his eyes for one imperceptible second. "Not at all, Gavin." He cleared his throat. "Sorry." It seemed comforting to Gavin until the detective roused, preparing to leave the mansion. "Please give me a call if anything else seems promising with respect to finding your wife." And with that, Crosby rounded up the officers on his detail and followed the entire task force out of the mansion. Gavin sat by himself on the couch. The house fell silent. Then, he saw it, another pile of powder. Once again, he knelt by the pile. Then saw another pile a few feet ahead. He knelt and touched his fingertips to it. It was Victoria's rouge as well. He looked up searching the floor for more. He found one a few feet away. A trail, he thought. He knelt near the next pile, searched around, and then he knelt near the pile he found after that. This went on through the living room, and into the servants' quarters, where Gavin had never stepped. These old colonial houses had all kinds of secret staircases, corridors, and chambers. The very thought of it had always given Gavin a creepy feeling, which is why he never came here. Gavin followed the powder trail up a hidden staircase he had never noticed before. As he ascended the staircase, paranoia came over him. When he reached the 5th floor, another powder trail led him through a corridor that connected a children's play den to the servants' quarters. Gavin proceeded, his heart racing. He had been in love with Victoria long enough to know when she was near. He began to greatly fear where the powder trail may be leading him. With his eyes glued to the floor, Gavin spotted pile after pile of powder until he found himself face to face with a wall. Gavin's hopes plummeted. The wall ran the entire length of the corridor. Gavin looked ceiling to floor and could not understand how something so promising as a trail of Victoria's powder could lead him to a random wall. He despaired and slammed his head against the wall as all hope escaped him. Gavin felt a slight sinking movement from the wall. Just then, a secret door to the right of where he stood slowly creaked open. He looked up surprised. He waited a long moment until the door finally stopped opening and peered inside. What he saw was a confined space, perhaps 8 by 8 space, generously speaking. All 4 walls of the room contained shelves that ranged from 6 inches to 1 foot, by Gavin's estimation, and every inch of shelf space was occupied by porcelain dolls. Gavin's heart began to race as he stepped inside the room, his head filling with thoughts. Why was it filled with dolls? Whose dolls were these? And why did the realtor not know about it, and clear them out? Most importantly, why did my missing wife's rouge lead me here? Gavin's gaze landed on one doll in particular. The doll had black hair and tan skin. Unlike the majority of dolls in the room, this one was not dressed in a turn-of-the-century gown and bonnet, but rather a contemporary red sweater, and blue jean skirt. Gavin picked the contemporary doll up in his hands and stared into its eyes. When the doll was upright, its eyes were open. And when he tipped it on its back, the eyes fell shut. Gavin played with this for a moment, tipping then elevating the doll. Suddenly, its right eye fell into its skull cavity and jingled around. Christ, Gavin said to himself. That's damn creepy. Then, for reasons even Gavin didn't understand, he lifted the doll to his nose and inhaled. He closed his eyes. It smelled just like Victoria. He lowered and once again looked at the doll. It was on its back and its eyelids were closed. It looked peaceful, and Gavin wondered if he would ever have a child. If he finds Victoria, would she want to have a baby? As he deeply considered this and stared into the closed eyes of this porcelain doll, the doll's eyes opened. To Gavin, it seemed the doll was looking at him dead in the eye. An hour later, Crosby stood in the center of the doll room as Gavin waited in the hall. "I don't care what it costs, her powder trail led me here, test everything for prints and DNA." "Yes, of course," said Crosby as he instructed his team to follow suit. Each officer exited the room with a handful of dolls. Each doll was bagged in plastic. By the time the last officer left, Gavin keeled over, drawing his hand to his eyes to hide the tears. "We'll find her," assured Crosby. "Call me as soon as you find something." After Gavin heard the last of the officer's footsteps descend the servants' staircase, he stepped back into the room and turned around again and again, studying the empty walls. Impatience overcame him and he extracted his cell phone from his pants pocket. Meanwhile, on the street outside, the officers loaded up their evidence van. One by one, each officer carried a handful of porcelain dolls into the van and dumped them in a pile. When the last officer was allowed sole access inside, he placed the 4 dolls he had carried onto the pile. But just as he was about to back up and hop out of the van, he noticed something peculiar. The eyes of all of the dolls floated open. He leaned forward to lift one of the dolls up and see what kind of mechanical dysfunction it had, when suddenly a porcelain doll plunged down onto his back. Alarmed, the officer grabbed the doll off his back, but it was too late. The army of dolls jumped onto him one after the other, and began to envelop the officer. Soon they smothered him, covering his nose and mouth, and eventually collapsed, gasping for air. Inside the mansion, with his cell phone pressed to his ear, Gavin listened to ringtone after ringtone, as he walked down the hallway. Tap tap tap. Gavin swung around and looked into the room, but the outgoing message in his ear distracted him. The realtor wasn't picking up, so Gavin left a message. "Hi, Gavin here, I know it's late. I love the house, just wanted to call about. Well, you had mentioned the house could be hazardous, and I didn't understand what you meant, but it's imperative that you call me back. So, please do." He hung up. Tap 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 tap. Gavin pivoted again. The sound had come from behind him in the secret room. Hearing a noise like that caused the possibility of rats to cross his mind. That's the last thing he needed. Suddenly, he was struck by a paranoid feeling that reminded him of how he felt climbing the staircase earlier. He never felt paranoid. Was this his instincts taking over? He turned around inside the secret room. The north wall was empty just as it was when the cops had left. The west, south, and east walls were all empty, too. But when Gavin turned slightly to the north wall with intentions to leave the room, he saw the black-haired contemporary doll sitting on a shelf. His eyes widened and his heart began racing. That doll wasn't there a second ago, was it? Gavin looked closely at the doll and saw that on its cheeks was a thick powder. Apricot blush? Gavin grew irate. He didn't know what was going on, but it wasn't funny. He wanted his wife back. A sharp anger came over him, and he raised the porcelain doll above his head ready to slam its face into the lacquered wood floor when his cell phone rang. Gavin lowered the doll and reached into his pocket. He fumbled slightly, but accepted the call. "Hello? Sorry to return your call so late, but this is important." It was his realtor. His voice sounded grave and shaky. "Not at all. Besides, I called first," said Gavin, who was fully alert to receive any information the realtor may have. "So?" He heard a long exhale on the other end of the phone. "Look, I don't know how to say this, because it's, well. I never thought it would affect you or your wife." "Just say it," Gavin pleaded. "The previous owners of the house. Well, the realtor paused for a few seconds. They disappeared. Not at the same time. First the wife went missing. Then, after, I think a day or two, the husband disappeared. neither of them was found. To this day, they remain missing. Gavin stood in silence. "Gavin? Are you still there?" After a long moment, Gavin screamed, "Why didn't you tell me this? I was trying to tell you beforehand, but..." Gavin threw his cell phone against the wall. It shattered on impact. He screamed and cried, pulling his hair out. Victoria. In a rage he had never before known, Gavin grabbed the porcelain doll by the head and smashed it against the wall. It fell to the ground, and he stomped on it in a fury. Then he stormed out of the room and down the hall. On the floor of the secret room, the shards of the porcelain doll reassembled themselves into the milky tan head of a contemporary doll. When all of the pieces found their proper fit, the doll's eyes opened and blinked rapidly. The doll sat up. Once in his bedroom, Gavin sat on his bed and a deep despair crept into his heart. What if he really never did see Victoria again? After brushing his teeth and changing into his night clothes, Gavin turned out the light and lied down in bed. Tap tap tap. Gavin hadn't reached sleep when the odd sound of feet tapping across the floor occurred again. He paused, holding his breath. Then soon enough. Tap 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 tap. Gavin opened his eyes and waited patiently as they adjusted to the dark. Tap 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 tap. He couldn't see anything except the far wall and the curtains on the adjoining wall. Annoyed, he threw the covers back and was about to get out of bed when a porcelain doll landed on his chest. What the hell? He grabbed the doll and threw it off of him across the room. When he sat up, 3 dolls jumped onto his back and head. He sprung out of bed, spinning and throwing the dolls off one by one and screaming. He ran to the other of the bedroom where the light switch was located, but before reaching it a dozen dolls jumped on him, taking a hold of his limbs. It knocked him off balance and he stumbled forward. Dolls lined the floor, causing him to trip. He fell headfirst into the bed frame. His forehead cracked against the hard mahogany corner of the footboard. From the ground Gavin shook his head, but the blow had severely disoriented him. He rolled over onto his back and took a deep breath. When he opened his eyes and cocked his head to the side, he saw in his periphery dozens of dolls with an evil glint in their eye. They crept towards Gavin, and just as he was about to sit up, the masses of them leapt onto him. He screamed, and tossed them off, one by one, but there were far too many. The porcelain dolls smothered Gavin to death. By the time moonlight shined, the dolls dragged his dead body across the bedroom floor and down the hall. They dragged him through a secret corridor and into the servants' kitchen, where they had been keeping the dead and rotting corpse of Victoria. The dolls propped Gavin up on a kitchen stool. Then posed Victoria with a teacup. They staged a scene where Victoria appeared to be serving Gavin morning tea to his favorite cup. Throughout the night, the dolls took turns playing with their life-sized toys. Author's note. This story is part of my book called A Telling Mind, Dark Thoughts. You can read the whole book for free and more by following the link provided. Credit to Ishmael Zuniga. Credit to Ishmael Zuniga. Credit to Ishmael Zuniga. People sometimes ask me what my first memory is. Invariably I lie, because I'm prone to avoid the explanation that comes with the truth. Maybe, from now on, if someone casually asks me what is your first memory, I will reach into my bag where there will be copies of the story and I will just hand one over. As they read it, their face will morph from confusion, into the furrowed brow of concern, and finally into the drop-jawed bewilderment that accompanies real fear. In passing, I tell people that my first memory was of me standing on a stool in front of my kitchen window. It was just after dusk in winter and from where I stood, I could make out the black limbs of the skeletal beech tree that loomed from across the driveway. While that is indeed a real memory, it's not the first one. If you want to hear about that, here it is. There was an unfortunate series of incidences that happened in the town where I grew up during the summer of 1989. By incidences, I mean murders. I'm not talking about your run-of-the-mill bar brawl gone too far or an act of passionate revenge. No. The events that happened in Middleton were far more grotesque. Even more so because the victims were children. I don't remember the heat wave that had swept Middleton that summer, the pink droplets of melted ice cream on the simmering pavement, or old men reclined in overstuffed chairs in shady living rooms. These precious details were told to me through family members and friends of my parents. They all, to this day, say that it was the hottest summer they have ever lived through. To make the weather even more unbearable, there were weekly brownouts that year due to some oversights at the electric plant in Salem. As a result, homes and businesses would go for hours at a time without air conditioning. Popsicles were promptly sold out in every business afternoon. Magazines and newspapers weren't read that summer, they were bought to be used as makeshift fans. It seemed that the only place where air conditioning still remained during these outages was the car. I've been told by relatives that it was not uncommon during that summer to find neighbors lounging back in their parked cars with the windows up, drinking a beer and listening to the radio. At times it was the only escape from the unbearable humidity and heat. That's why, when mothers would go shopping, it became impossible to pull their children from their cars. After all, the kids knew that the inside of whatever clothing or grocery store their mother had taken them to was probably as hot if not hotter than the parking lot. The coolest and best place to be was in the car, with the windows rolled up and that gentle whispering wind seeping through the vents. With this setting in mind, you can understand how Mr. Teeth, as he was later called by newspapers, had his pick of the litter, so to speak. He knew that in any given lot outside of a busy grocery or department store, there would be at least 2 or 3 cars where the children had been left inside. One such car was parked outside of the Market Basket on the afternoon of June 3rd. Within sat Jeremy Hager, a freckled 8-year-old with a penchant for action figures. When Jeremy's mother returned from her quick dash for butter, she found the back right door of the vehicle ajar, a Darth Vader doll left abandoned on the back seat. News of the disappearance radiated through the town over the following week up until the day when a jogger noticed a small black Reebok laying in the grass on the edge of the reservoir. Not long afterward, Jeremy's body was pulled from the brown water and sent to the morgue. It was there that doctors noted what appeared to be bite marks on the boy's arms and neck. Victim number 2 was Amanda DeMiller, a girl of 7 who had fallen asleep on her way home from shopping with her mother on July 18th. As was common in those days, a parent might leave their sleeping child in the car once at home. Britta DeMiller, Amanda's mother, later told police that with the house being as hot as it was, she had thought that Amanda would sleep better in the car with the sliding side door left open. At some point Mrs. DeMiller looked out the window to see that Amanda was no longer in her seat. The family lived on a fairly wooded road leading into the forests of Middleton. Neighbors were widely separated from one another. Mr. and Mrs. DeMiller spent all of that night scouring the narrow back roads, knocking on the doors of the occasional houses. After only a 3-day search, a local boy found Amanda's body slumped in the corner of his tree house. Her throat was purple from strangulation and covered with bite marks. Her shoes were on the wrong feet. Anyway, that's how the story goes. Advertisement. That brings us to my first memory. My parents have since placed the date of this memory to around the 3rd or 4th week of August. It had been about a month since Amanda DeMiller's murder, but no one had been apprehended. People in town were still on edge. It was at that time, one afternoon, when I sat in the front seat of my mom's rusty Toyota parked in the giant lot of Henry's grocery store. I remember that there was a car parked on either side of my mother's, and in front of the Toyota was one of those corrals for shopping carts. There was music playing quietly on the radio, Madonna maybe, and my hands were sticky from eating candy. You may wonder how, with all of the horrors that had plagued Middleton that summer, my mother could have left me alone in the car. The fact is, she hadn't. My older brother, Stephen, age 12 at the time, had been designated as my temporary guardian while she made an emergency stop for flour. It was this temporary guardian who decided that this was the perfect opportunity to run to the bookstore nearby to buy a deck of collectible cards. Before he dashed out of the back seat, I remember him saying something like, "Don't go anywhere." So there I sat, waiting for one or both of my family members to return. It was then that I saw him, and it's this part which is clear even to this day. The halogen lamps had just come on all across the lot. They cast that greenish glow from just being turned on. The sky beyond the pines that bordered the market was streaked with pink and purple. It must have been around 7:30. I remember first seeing him, standing there some 30 feet from the front of our car. Almost instantly, the music from the radio faded from my ears along with the sharp rattle of carriage wheels on the old pavement. Transfixed, silent, I stared out the windshield at this lanky gaunt figure framed by pink and purple sky. Through a curtain of greasy black hair falling across his brow, I discerned a single eye. It seemed to sort of take on the green glow of those halogen lights. He tilted his head back a bit and the hint of a smile danced across his thin lips. He must have stood and stared through the windshield at me, transfixed and spellbound as I was, for one whole minute. He then started a slow walk over to my side of the car, never taking his eye from mine. Once he was outside my door, he looked down his long beak-like nose at me. Then looking around, he began to wiggle the handle. "Open up," he said, looking down at me again. I just stared at him without saying anything. Again, "Open up." His long skeletal fingers left the door handle and started to dance across my window, tapping here and there. He crouched down so that he was at my level and started a sort of puppet show with his hands. His dirty fingers dashed across the glass like great pale spiders in a deadly battle. He looked at them and laughed, making hissing and growling sounds. As he made these sounds, his mouth opened up into a full grin and I had a look inside, at rows of long yellow teeth. They are, to this day, the longest and largest teeth I've ever seen. There were gaps between them and they reminded me vaguely of dirty piano keys. He seemed to be completely immersed in his spider battle, giggling and clawing at each of his hands. At one point, he noticed that my window was open just a crack at the top. He looked at me grinning with those mighty teeth and crawled one of his hand spiders up to the space. I was openly sobbing at this point. He managed to squeeze the tips of 4 fingers through the opening. I caught a greasy whiff of unwashed clothes mingled with the sweet scent of blood. "Come on. Open up," he said, in a whiny, pleading voice. "Open up." He said this same sentence in a dozen different voices, from a girly voice to a thick lumberjack one. By sheer luck, the woman who was parked on the passenger side of our car, returned with all 4 of her noisy kids in tow. Upon seeing her, the man scurried off in a duck walk towards the cart corral where he smoothly stood up straight and walked off into the parking lot. But not before looking over his shoulder, gnashing those massive teeth, and catching me with one final blood-chilling stare. The memory ends there. It was later explained to me that my brother had returned to the car to find me crying hysterically. No matter what he said to calm me through the glass, apparently, I wouldn't unlock the doors. My mother returned soon after. She said that all I could manage to say through thick sobs was, "There was a man." I just kept repeating it for hours after that. There was a man. Like the insufferable heat, so too did the Middleton murders come to an end with the changing of the seasons. Just 2 weeks after my parking lot encounter, the child killer, who was later identified as Raymond Sandler, age 29, was caught after taking a young girl from a birthday party at a roller rink in Beverly. A worker on his coffee break at the adjacent gas station saw a thin man lead the girl out the back door of the rink and attempt to force her into a red car. The worker called the cops and the car was pulled over on Route 128 just outside of Gloucester. While I don't remember it, I first made the connection between the man in the parking lot and Mr. Teeth by seeing my father's newspaper on the coffee table the day after Sandler's capture. There, in a large blown-up black and white, was the same ghastly face I'd seen just inches from mine with only a layer of glass separating us. Apparently, I didn't make it to school the day I saw the newspaper on account of I couldn't stop screaming. Knowing that I had almost been a victim myself, my family and people around Middleton weren't willing to tell me anything about the killer once I grew curious, years later. I suppose they didn't want to freak me out more than I already was. So, in high school, I did some of my own research. I learned that the Boston Globe had first coined the nickname Mr. Teeth both on account of Sandler's unusually large incisors and his habit of biting the skin of his victims. His means of killing was almost exclusively strangulation. Due to his being diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, Sandler was often delusional. As a result, his story regularly changed. However, after being asked several times, the number of murders he confessed to, while varying, never went above 10. It was also noted in research on Sandler that he only hunted in the summertime. Some speculated that this was because of the easy access to children who had been left in cool cars while their parents went in to shop. Others suggested that the hot weather triggered something inside of Sandler, something that lay dormant during the fall and winter, then awoke once the temperature hit 80. Who can say? The years have softened that first memory a bit. I am almost 40 now and, while that hideous grin isn't quite as distinct as it used to be, I still see it sometimes when I wake up at night, usually in the warmer months. Someday, one of my two girls, who know nothing of the summer of '89, may ask when they're older, "Hey, Dad? What's your first memory?" Maybe I'll tell them about the time I was on the stool in my kitchen looking out at the old beech tree. Or maybe I'll just say, "Teeth. I remember teeth." I'll just say, "Teeth. I remember teeth." My father grew up on an Indian reservation in South Dakota. It is a place with few trees and even fewer people, and there has been little development since the place was settled many, many years ago. The people live in clusters of nearly uniform houses that were built by the government, and the only place to go shopping or see a movie is nearly 2 hours away. It's hot in the summer, cold in the winter, and sometimes the wind blows for days without letting up. Even now, the people there have to be tough to survive. You look out for your friends, you help your neighbors, and you don't forget your family. His grandmother died when he was very young, but he's told me that he retains one particularly vivid memory of her. It was winter and they were at the house together in the early evening, and she was cooking in the kitchen while he played with a deck of cards in the front room. He can't quite recall what she looked like, but he can still remember the smell of the food that she was making that night. It's funny how memory works that way. His parents, grandfather, and two older sisters had caught a ride into Rapid City to buy supplies before the first big storms came through, so it was just the two of them. She went on cooking and he went on playing with those cards until he lost track of time and it was pitch black outside. There was a knock at the door. Not a loud knock like the police, or the friendly kind of knock that a neighbor uses when he's stopping by to borrow something. Just a slow, quiet tapping on the door. Tap, 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 just like that. Naturally, he figured his family had made it back from the city, so he went right over to let them inside. Before he had a chance to reach the door, his frail, elderly grandmother grabbed him by the arm and pulled him away, like he was a rag doll. "Never answer the door at night," she told him, covering his mouth so he couldn't say anything. He could feel her arm trembling. There was no more knocking, but my father couldn't shake the sense that there was someone familiar standing on the other side of that door, waiting to be let inside. When she finally let go of him, he asked her why she had stopped him. "Sometimes the dead try to come home," she said. There were tears in her eyes. His family didn't return that night, and there was no phone service so they couldn't call. When they made it back the following day, he learned that his grandfather had died from a heart attack during the trip. My father never said anything about the knocking, and neither did his grandmother. It was like it had never happened. His grandmother wasn't the same after that and followed her husband to the grave just a few months later. My father was 6 years old. It was much later when my father found himself alone at night during a particularly bad winter storm, the wind howling outside and the rest of his family stranded miles away. They had gone into the city that morning, and wouldn't be able to come back until the storm let up and the roads were cleared. Eventually the electricity went out and the only light came from the stove they used for heating. The worst part of the storm lasted a few hours, but finally it got quiet outside as the wind slowed and the windows stopped rattling. Then the knock came again. That same tapping at the door from years before, like fingers just barely brushing against it. My father couldn't bring himself to look out the window to see if anyone was standing outside, but for some reason, he found himself drawn to the door, like he had to open it. It was only when he felt the cold from beneath the door on his bare feet that he stopped. He called outside, asking who was there. "It's me," came the voice from the other side of the door. "Let me inside. It's cold." He recognized the voice, since it belonged to his eldest sister. He had his hand on the doorknob when his grandmother's words came back to him, and the feel of her hand gripping his arm. Never answer the door at night. There were many things he could have asked his sister at that moment. He could have asked where his parents were, or why he hadn't heard the car pull up when they were dropped off. He could have even asked why she needed to knock at all. They didn't lock their doors on the reservation. He didn't ask her any of those things. Instead, he told her to go around to the back and he would let her inside. Before he could say anything else, or even think anything else, he heard the knocking start at the back door, like she had been there the entire time. Instantly. Tap, tap, tap. He didn't open the door, and spent the rest of the night curled up on the floor. His family had tried to return home earlier that evening and got into a car accident in the snow. His father had broken his leg in 2 places. His eldest sister had died, mangled in the wreck. He didn't tell anyone what had happened, but he knew in his heart that sometimes the dead do try to come home. My father was not afraid of what might have happened that night. When he told me the story, he was sorrowful. He always regretted that he lost his opportunity to see his sister one last time. I know that's why he went home by himself and waited when my mother died. You don't forget your family. I know he heard that knocking on the door, tap, 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 like he remembered from his youth. I also know that he forgot something, very, very important. The fear in his grandmother's voice on that cold winter night, and the way she held him with all her strength. Never answer the door at night. When we found him the next day, the front door was wide open and he had been torn limb from limb. There were no footprints in the snow. There are so many things that I wish could be buried in the deepest parts of my mind. There are things that I pray could be locked away forever. The truth though is that once something like that happens, there really is no way to get away from it. I guess that is why I felt the need to share my story with everyone. The only way to stop it from eating away at my mind might be to let others know what happened to my friends and I that weekend. You see, school had just gotten out and I wanted to do something noteworthy to start off summer break. I was always a sucker for the outdoors, so I talked to my best friend Michael about going camping in the forest. He was a little sketchy at first, but we had been on these types of trips before. During those times things always turned out great, so he agreed, and from that point we got others to join us. In the end it was me, Michael, Jesse, and Samantha all packed into a single car driving down the highway. Our trunk was stuffed to the brim with food, tents and all the gear we were going to need. Of all the places we could have gone to in Canada, we chose the Aspen Parkland. I can't remember what it was that made me choose that place. When it came down to it, I remember pointing to the closest place on Google Maps and we started our journey. It took us about 3 hours to drive up there, but when we stepped out of that car and felt the breeze push against our skin, we knew that it was well worth the wait. I hopped onto the hood of my car immediately and closed my eyes as the wind blew through my hair. Jesse and Michael were out running through the field of grass trying to race each other, and Samantha of course had gone to the one spot upwind and lit up a cigarette. The smoke made me open my eyes immediately just to see her sitting in the grass like a native with her legs crossed. I was planning to yell at her, but I didn't see the point, so I slid off the hood and unlocked up the trunk. All of our bags had been packed before we got there, so I grabbed mine and jimmied it over my shoulders. Samantha bolted up from the ground and ran over to get hers on. "We're heading out already?" "Might as well," I said back to her. And with that she got her pack on and we both called out to Michael and Jesse, who got theirs on. The 4 of us felt like explorers of some kind when we set off into the wilderness. The weather was a bit chilly, but the adventure in our hearts was far beyond that of any child. Maybe that is pulling threads a little too thin, but I am just being honest with the way I felt. We must have walked for a good mile before we reached the forest line that we had spotted earlier. I was the first to enter the brush and I beckoned the others after me. They followed close behind since I was the only one with any real outdoor experience. More than once a few of them jumped back in fright at the sight of a squirrel, or anything that moved for that matter. When we had reached an opening in the trees we had found a small creek to fill up our canteens. As I filled my canteen they all stopped dead in their tracks to look up. My head rose to meet their gaze and the four of us saw it. There was a beautiful Canadian moose just a few feet away from the creek we were resting at. We watched as it drank from the creek, completely ignoring us. Samantha struggled to get her phone out to take a picture while Michael tried to get closer so that I could whisper out some moose trivia. It stayed there at the creek for only about 5 minutes before leaving, but it made an impression on all of us. I wish that it could have been where we headed back to the car and set up our tents, but fate had other things planned for us. Just as the moose was out of our view, we saw something else emerge from the forest. On the other side of the creek, at the top of a small hill, was a completely naked man. He was tall and muscular with hair covering his chest and legs like a wild beast. His sideburns were like delicious lamb chops of fury, his eyebrows were angled strongly enough to invoke fear into all of us. We were scared the second we saw him. We became petrified when we saw the hand axe clutched in his right palm. None of us dared speak, but he saw the four of us there at the creek with our canteens in our hands. And he called out to us in his thick Canadian accent. "You youngsters. What are you doing around these parts? Don't you know there is a serial killer around here trying to kill people?" Michael locked eyes with the man and shook his head in despair. None of us dared to look away from his naked body for even a second. We kept our vision dead square upon him. He would occasionally scratch his junk while the soft wind blew against our faces, and in that moment it felt like we were in a swamp filled thick with maple syrup. I tried to stay calm, but I knew that he was seriously messed up when he procured a stack of pancakes from out of nowhere and then began to eat them right in front of us. I tried to resist the urge to go and join him, and luckily my willpower was strong enough to hold me back. Jesse's willpower was not. He removed his pack and began stepping towards the naked Canadian. We tried to warn him, but he was in a trance. He stood beside the crazed Canadian. "Mind if I have some?" Jesse asked. The Canadian raised his knife and brought it down into the stack of pancakes, cutting them dead in half and then handing the other half to Jesse. "Sure thing, have as much as you like, I got plenty with me." Just when we thought the horror was over, the Canadian lowered his hands again and pulled up several more plates loaded with pancakes. I tried to be polite about it when he offered them to me. "No thank you sir, I'm not very hungry," but every time I rejected his offers I felt a knot tie inside my heart. I knew the polite thing to do would be to accept the pancakes, but doing so would mean my doom. It was already happening to Jesse. The Canadian man was talking to him and making him feel nice and at home. But I could never trust a fully nude man since the incident at summer camp. Maybe a semi-nude man, but definitely not a completely naked one. So there Jesse and the man sat, right at the top of the ridge by the creek. The two of them sat there eating those fluffy light pancakes with sweet sticky syrup topping, and it made the rest of us water at the mouth. But our pre-assumptions were broken and we learned how bitter the syrup could be. The Canadian stood up after finishing his plate of pancakes and he pulled out a large pot. Once again I have no idea where he was getting these things. He lifted the pot above his head and we could see steam rising through the top. Before we could warn him, we watched as boiling hot syrup was poured all over his body. Jesse screamed out so loudly that it seemed his mouth was about to break. "Sorry about that." My hand slipped. Those words swept through us like fire, and we knew he was still the sadistic and polite Canadian we had known him to be. But what could we do? He apologized, and because of that it would be rude if we ran away, and so we stood still and gave him some common courtesy, Jesse included. I was shocked to find that although Jesse was in agonizing pain he stood still and tried to finish the pancakes. There was not much else he could do in the presence of such a polite man. I took my eyes off of him for 1 second and found him again with his hand upon his knife and his knife inside of Mike. Mike's body twitched with the blade deep in his belly and uttered out the words, "W.Y?" The Canadian smiled and placed one hand against the back of his head and said, "Geez, I just seem to be a klutz today. Sorry about all that, didn't mean to stab you. Damn it, I thought to myself, with all of this politeness he might just get the best of us. Sam and I clutched our hands together and closed our eyes. The last thing we saw was the Canadian walking towards us with his knife, waiting to accidentally run into us with it. We waited for the blade to pierce us, but it never did. Instead, we heard nothing but silence. Then we smelled it, the fresh aroma of maple leaves. When we finally had the courage to open our eyes, we saw our red-clothed savior standing between the killer and us. It was a Canadian trooper in full apparel with his entire body in the master of manners position. Don't worry kids, you're safe now. My soul flew back into the realm of existence when I heard him say that to me. I doubted his power at first, but the two Canadians were locked in battle of politeness, and every second that they fought was a second Samantha and I would be alive. Nothing happened for the longest time, it was just the wind blowing and a few hand signals between the two. Occasionally they would bow. But our hero was turned into a monster when the naked Canadian said to the trooper, "Would you please kill that girl behind you?" Shit, he did it again, he asked politely, and now the Canadian trooper had his hands around Samantha. Tears rolled down his eyes as life left her body and the blood disappeared from her anguished face. She collapsed and the knife was now deep inside the trooper, with the naked Canadian behind him whispering into his ear, "Sorry about that, I was just trying to murder you." "No problem," I said the trooper as he fell to the floor with the knife still firm in his back. "I know for certain I would have been next if it weren't for my quick thinking." "Excuse me sir, would you mind if I ran back to my car and escaped your murderous rampage?" The words came blurting out of my mouth and I ended up having to say the phrase twice, but it worked. The naked man grew tired in his eyes as he waited patiently for me to escape his bloodlust, so I did just that. I ran at a steady pace all the way to my car, and when the keys met the ignition my foot met the pedal and my memories left that place behind. I told the police about it several days later, but they never went to search for him because doing so would be impolite by Canadian police standards. They did however find the dead bodies of my friends in that forest. The polite and murderous Canadian had properly buried them. It was a nice gesture, but only I know the truth about his intentions, only I know the true shades of his swelling predatorial nature. To this day the scars of my psyche remain apparent in my life. No longer can I eat pancakes, the smell of syrup makes me nauseous. My hands begin to shake whenever I turn on the hockey channel. Even though I know he is gone, I never know for how long. Even now I still have haunting of his presence. I have found maple leaves in my mailbox, and sometimes when I go shopping there is someone politely holding the door for me. But most of all I still hear his animalistic call. The neighborhood always was a tight-knit community. The gatehouse kept out all the wrong people, and the rotation of retiree guards provided a second filter for the riffraff. Most homes went for over $500,000, but a few sold in the $250,000 range. All of those, they were in the back, all on one cul-de-sac. They all used the community pool. It came as a bit of a scandal, then, when it wasn't one of those houses that went into foreclosure. It came as a bit of a scandal, then, when it wasn't one of those houses that had the owners go missing. They vanished. They didn't just disappear into thin air, though. Oh, no. That would have been preferred. They let the grass go, first. Neighborhood association letters and fines and summons piled up. It was quite scandalous when they actually lit a little fire in their driveway, burning all the notices. In a further act of defiance, they stopped taking their trash to the curb. So it was a relief when the young family of 3 who lived there just left. All their possessions, except a suitcase each in one of their cars, poof. Gone. Internet money, the whispers went. They never really belonged here at all, people said. I heard they found their minivan in long-term parking at the airport, they claimed. That part was true. They did. And nothing else. Meanwhile, the bank foreclosed. The yard was tended to by the neighborhood association, the house went on the market. More new money moved in, but they seemed a respectable sort, so they were welcomed to Mallard Street. As it happened, They settled in right around Halloween, just in time for the kids to trick-or-treat and the parents to mingle at a couple of parties. The first time the Jones met the Emersons, right next door, everyone was enjoying drinks, hilarious costumes, and the most delicious barbecue ever tasted, served from what was probably the largest, most complex smoker anyone had ever seen. The Jones family were the newcomers, and they raved about the dinner and hospitality, and Mr. Jones asked about the smoker. James Emerson, proprietor of the region's largest packing house, explained that he competed in barbecue cook-offs for fun, and he nicknamed his smoker the Long Pig. He liked to share his talents with friends, family, and neighbors at all major holidays and excuses to throw a party. Everyone likes to come over for my dinners. Good fences don't make good neighbors, he'd joke, good sauces do. Just wait until Thanksgiving, he winked. We won't be doing turkey. I have something special planned. Everyone got on famously. Thanksgiving arrived. The Emersons invited all of Mallard Street, and quite a few folks from other places in the gated community, but no one from that cul-de-sac, for a Black Friday night party. The smoker could be smelled all the way up at the guard shack starting Wednesday night. As promised, the barbecue was amazing. Mr. Emerson had saved the youngest, tenderest of quality meats for the holiday season. What are you thankful for? Mr. Jones asked as he enjoyed a plate, savoring each bite because he took the last available serving. New, respectable neighbors, Mr. Emerson responded, stealing a glance at his wife and seeing her smirk where the Jones family couldn't see. I'm incredibly thankful that we've run out of the terrible ones. Now that the freezer is empty, dear, I think we'll switch to beef for the Christmas party, Mrs. Emerson commented, offhandedly. Everyone chatted and dined as the Long Pig ticked and popped, cooling in the November chill. Credit to Nico Caliban. Joe slouched happily on his bar stool riding the best buzz of his life. Frankie sat next to him, nervously scanning the room. Holy shit, Frankie. Holy shit. There was something in that last one. Dunno what it was but whoo mama. I gotta get me another one of those. It was Saturday night and the bar was crowded with 20 and 30-somethings, a dull roar of conversation filling the air as they joked and flirted. Despite this, Joe was being loud enough to draw some annoyed glares from the patrons closest to where they were sitting. Frankie gave the cute blonde next to him an apologetic smile and she rolled her eyes before turning back to the Clint Eastwood lookalike currently chatting her up. Frankie swallowed hard. Would you shut the fuck up, Joe? First, you can't have another one of those because you got us kicked out of that bar. Honestly, man, I have no idea how you've survived this long the way you act. That chick's boyfriend is gonna be pissed after what you pulled and I'm not totally sure they didn't follow us here. Joe's drunken ebullience turned sullen in an instant as he sulkily leaned across the bar, his scowl fixed on the bowl of peanuts resting between them. Whatever, Frankie. Let him come. Flower Power back there wants to make an issue of it, he's more than welcome to try. I'll feed his head to his own asshole. Prick has a problem with me, he should learn how to keep a tighter watch of his woman. Frankie sighed. He'd been out with Joe enough to know there was no reasoning with him when he got like this. Yeah, I'm sure you would, Joe. Anyway, we should think about getting back to the house. You know how pissed Boris gets when we miss curfew. It's getting late, and if we don't get back soon we're gonna be toast. Oh, Frankie, you little bitch. Fuck Boris. You know that his hat just likes to think he's got control of us. What's he care if we come in at 2 or 3? No difference. I'm getting another drink before we go. Frankie reached over and pulled on Joe's shoulder. Damn it, Joe, you don't need another drink. You're drunk enough as is, any more anew and you're likely to start something that'll have us against the whole damn bar. And I don't care how tough you think you are, if that happens we are going to most likely get the shit kicked out of us. Then we'll be lucky if we can crawl back to Boris' place and even luckier if he lets us inside. A cold metallic sheen slid over Joe's eyes and his mouth drew into a hard line as he reached up and took hold of Frankie's wrist in a crushing grip. Get your fucking hands off me, Frankie. Frankie let go of Joe's coat and gulped. Yeah, sure, Joe. Whatever you say, man. A single bead of sweat rolled down Frankie's forehead as Joe increased the pressure of his hold, tight enough to leave bruises. Abruptly, Joe smiled and released Frankie's wrist. See there? That wasn't so hard, was it? Now don't get your panties all in a bunch. One more drink and we'll head back to the house so old Mother Boris won't be concerned, okay? Frankie slumped unhappily in his stool, rubbing his sore wrist. Okay. Yeah, okay. One last drink. Just try to control yourself, would you? For me? Joe laughed. Only for you, Frankie. Now then, let's see, what do I want? Better make it something special since you're rushing me over here and what is that smell? Frankie noticed it too, the scent of fresh bloomed lilacs ever so subtly laced with something muskier. The two men turned to look at the same time and were simultaneously struck, dumbfounded. The woman that stood in the entryway of the bar was a vision. Large almond eyes the color of dark chocolate were set above lips as plump as ripened cherries. A careless tumble of jet black curls framed the incredibly pale skin of her face, hair so thick it seemed to beg a man to run it through his fingers. She was dressed in a modest black dress that nevertheless served to accentuate her soft curves, the effect exponentially more rousing than any of the far more revealing outfits most of the other female patrons were decked out in. The roar of the room had descended to a quiet buzzing. Taking a moment to survey the crowd, the ghost of a smile reached the corners of her mouth before she made her way to the bar, the gentle sway of her hips holding the profound attention of every man in the room as well as the unmasked disgust of many of the women. Sliding smoothly onto a stool 10 feet down the bar from Joe and Frankie, the spell was abruptly broken and threads of conversation began to pick up again around them. Joe turned to Frankie excitedly. Frankie, I am gonna tap that shit. Frankie sighed. Joe, really? Every other guy in here just thought the same thing, man. I mean, look at her. No way is she dumb enough to go anywhere with you. Let's just get out of here. That chick is trouble, I can feel it. There's just something about her that isn't apostrophe T. right, you know? Something off. Joe grinned. Yeah, there's something off. See that pale skin? Profound lack of vitamin D. Fortunately for her, I have the cure. Watch and learn. Joe. Look, if she shoots me down, we go home, okay? I won't even try to get another drink. Fine, I'm holding you to that. I'll see you back here in 2 minutes, then we're gone. Joe flashed a tooth-bearing grin and laughed before sauntering towards the woman who already had 3 other men clustered around her. Frankie leaned back against the bar, ready to observe the comedy that was surely about to unfold. He could see her watching Joe out of the corner of her eye as he approached, only turning to give him her full attention when he'd gotten close enough to throw her one of his patented pickup lines. Here it comes, Frankie thought, the part where she throws her head back and laughs her ass off. Maybe if he uses one of his extra special lines, those other guys there will do me a favor and lay him out. Then I'll just have to get the bouncer to help me cart the shithead to a cab. He could see Joe say something then, to Frankie's amazement, the woman's mouth curled into a wicked grin, her eyes burning with lust-filled desire as she hungrily stared at Joe. She raised a single finger to the lips of the man standing next to her who had been obliviously trying to carry on a conversation before grabbing Joe by the hand and pulling him behind her towards the restrooms at the back of the bar. Joe had time to flash Frankie an excited thumbs up across the room before the door slammed shut behind them. Frankie's mouth dropped open in shock. Holy shit, he muttered to himself, maybe I should see about getting another drink after all. Instead he simply sat at the bar, waiting for Joe to finish whatever the hell he was doing back there. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Then 15. After 20 minutes Frankie began to get worried. At 30 he got up and started to make his way back to the restroom. Joe would be pissed if Frankie was interrupting, but damn it, they'd already missed curfew. He shoved through the bathroom door and stopped, unable to believe what he saw. Joe stood slumped against the back wall of the restroom, his arms held on either side by men built like professional linebackers and looking like he'd been beaten to hell. The sultry woman standing in front of him was wielding a pair of pliers. As Frankie watched, she reached into Joe's mouth with the tool and, accompanied by a sickening series of cracking pops, ripped one of his teeth out to join the small pile already on the tiled floor beside her. Joe moaned softly as bright red blood steadily pulsed out of his mouth and down his chin and chest. Frankie stepped farther into the room. "Hey! What the fuck are you doing to him? If he could get one of those guys off Joe, they might just stand a chance of getting the hell out of there." He briefly registered movement to his rear and realized another assailant must have been hidden behind the door. Before he could turn, he felt the sharp stab of a needle, then something like liquid fire injected into his neck. Frankie fell to the floor screaming and writhing in pain as the poison did its work before finally passing into blessed unconsciousness. Ice-cold water poured over his head woke him up, sputtering. Frankie coughed and blinked his eyes, a dull burning still echoing from his neck where he'd been injected earlier. His mouth was so dry, it felt like sandpaper. He looked around. He was sitting, tied to a chair in the middle of a nondescript warehouse, the pale light of dawn shining through the dirt-encrusted windows high above. To his right he saw Joe was secured to another chair in a similar fashion, so battered and bruised that if Frankie didn't know better he would have thought the man was dead. The woman stood in front of him holding a bucket, flanked on either side by a pair of her black-clad goons. She'd changed out of her dress from the bar into the same military-style clothing the men wore. She smiled as Joe moaned through his mouth full of missing teeth, his head lolling in a circle. "So sorry to wake you, boys," she purred, her voice velvet over steel, "but I wanted to make sure you were conscious for the big finish." "Fuck, lady. What the hell is happening?" Frankie croaked. "Who are you? What the fuck are you doing to us? Please, give me something to drink." She gestured to one of the men standing beside her, Morris. The man stepped forward and Frankie saw he held a pint-sized bag of blood in his enormous hands. Fingers moving deftly for a man of his size, he inserted one end of a small plastic tube into the bag and held the other end over Frankie's mouth. A few small drops bled from the tube onto Frankie's tongue, salty and so rich he almost gagged. Then the man called Morris was gone, administering the same to Joe before returning to the woman's side. "There," the woman smiled, "one last drink. In answer to your previous questions, my name is Morgana Fontaine. What is happening is I am avenging the death of my darling sister and countless other victims of your horrific appetites." She turned and walked to the sliding cargo door on the side of the warehouse. "And what I am doing," she said, heaving at the chain to raise the door, "is ridding the world of two more godforsaken parasites." Facing east, the light of the morning sun streamed through the doorway directly onto the two prisoners strapped in their chairs. As the first rays touched them, the men's skin began to blacken and steam before spontaneously bursting into flame. Now fully alight, Joe and Frankie's screams echoed throughout the empty warehouse, pockets of fat under their skin bubbling and bursting, their eyes melting in their sockets. Morgana and her companions stood watching the conflagration, unblinking, until all that was left of the vampires were two small piles of dust and a pair of greasy black stains. Approaching the remains, Morgana noisily hawked and spat a healthy wad of phlegm into the ash. "For my sister. Let's get this cleaned up and get some breakfast, boys. I'm hungry." With that, the hunter turned her back, heavy boot heels clicking as she walked through the warehouse door into the welcoming light of day. Credit to Shadows Wimmer 77. Credit to Shadows Wimmer 77. I've always found it particularly difficult to start a story. It's easy to end one, but ever since grade school when my teachers would make me write a short story, I could never make a good start. I suppose I'll start by saying this is a story. A story about my best friend. He died about 2 years ago. He was in his living room, sitting, watching TV, and he had a heart attack. And boom. Just like that he's dead. Gone. Bye-bye. See you later. It was really shocking when I found out. He was a hard-working man who was a mechanic. He always was sweating from physical labor. It didn't make any sense how he could have possibly died from a blocked artery. But I guess some things aren't always what they seem in this life. We went to his funeral. It was a simple service. Family and friends of his showed up. We said a few words about him. We cried and all the usual stuff at a funeral. Then we put him in the ground. And we left. I got over his death okay. I was sad for quite a while, but I knew that he wouldn't want me to sit there sad all the time. Stop being a wuss and get on with your life, he'd say. He was just that kind of guy, a tough, skinny guy, with a mouth full of lemon juice. His name was Tom. You could see him from miles around, walking around with his big ego, flaunting himself round like his SHT didn't stink. Hilariously enough, it usually didn't. As you can guess by the joke, we were real close. As kids we were inseparable. We'd spend our nights and days causing trouble around our small town, ding-dong ditching and throwing eggs at random old ladies and such. We grew up and I got married to a beautiful wife. He stayed single, preferring to be a one-night stand kind of guy. He even made me a special promise a long time ago. "Percy," he said, "if either one of us goes off to the big yonder before the other, the one that goes should come back and tell the other what it's like up there in heaven." I wasn't too thrilled with the idea. "But I wouldn't want you to come back. I want to find out for myself what the light is." He grunted in annoyance. "Ugh, fine. I still want one of us to come back though." He scratched his nose and thought. "But only if we have something really important to tell the other person. Like if they're going to be in an accident or something." We agreed and shook on it. It was a promise I know he couldn't keep. But for a while I really wish he could. As I said though, I moved on with my life. He did, however, keep his promise. As sunset on a summer day, I sat in my living room, like I usually did, with my gorgeous wife cooking dinner in the kitchen. I had just finished an episode of Seinfeld and was lazily looking out my window at the oranges and dark pinks the sun was making on the clouds. Suddenly, I got a knock on my door. It was slow and quiet, and if I wasn't paying attention, I would have thought it was a tree branch hitting the side of the house due to the wind. Knock. Knock. Plain as day. After about 4 knocks I got up from my chair and yelled, "I'm coming." At the door. As walked toward it, something didn't feel right. Like I shouldn't open the door. Like if I did, harm would befall me. I ignored my feelings and went up to it and turned the knob. No one was there. Great. It was probably the damn neighbor kids. I stepped outside cautiously, looking for any sign of the little intruders. I was shocked out of my mind when I saw him standing there. It was my friend. Albeit, not at all like he was when he was alive, but it was definitely him. He stood there, one leg shorter than the other, still wearing the suit he was buried in. His suit was torn and caked with dirt and moss. It was faded and smeared with stains of various body fluids. As for his body itself, it was literally skin and bones. His skin was no longer tan from hours out in the sun, but now it was gray, dry and cracked. It covered his bones and looked like someone had outlined them with sandpaper, and parts were curled up like cinnamon, revealing the red and white of his aged bones. The contours of his body were distorted like he had been molded out of wax, and his face was the shadow of what it was originally. It was a skull, the hair wisps of thin string and tangles of matted mud and old pieces of wood shavings. His ears and nose had decayed away, revealing morbid holes that looked like caves. His mouth was exposed, his lips long since parted, showing off his teeth and tongue. Entire parts of his lower set were completely gone, and I could see the divots where the teeth's roots had once been. But the eyes were the worst part. They had only partially decomposed, the water having seeped out long ago, but his irises and the white stayed behind, each eye looking like a deflated beach ball. The pupils stared blankly at me, as if they could steal my soul at any moment. I stood there in absolute shock and fear, completely paralyzed. He spoke, breaking the silence. "You didn't think I could do it, did you?" His voice was weak and raspy like a smoker's. And yet, even with him being so far away, it was as if he was speaking right in my ear. When he opened his mouth, What should have been his tongue was replaced by a gob of black goo that squeezed out of his mouth, flowed down his neck, soaking what remained of his white undershirt. I breathed out heavily, still looking at him, and said, "That isn't possible. You're supposed to be in your grave." "I know you're afraid," he said, "but it really is me. We need to talk. Can I come inside?" I stepped aside and pointed my arms towards the door. He walked up slowly, his short leg dragging his long leg behind him. His arms swung around him. He struggled to breathe, his breath long and wheezing. I opened the door, resisting the urge to throw up as I got the first whiff of his odor. It wasn't exactly like rotten meat, but more of a mold and dead rat smell mixed with a household cleaner. It burned my throat when I breathed it in. He went in, and fell upon my couch. My wife called from the kitchen. "Han, who's at the—" "Nobody," I said, quickly cutting her off. "Just an old friend." "Okay, dear," she said, returning to her work. I turned and walked back into the living room where Tom was waiting. Well, I've been dying to see you," he said. He burst out in laughter at his pun. His laugh sounded like an old man choking on cotton. I looked at him unhappily. "Why are you here, Tom?" "Funny you should ask. You remember our agreement, don't you?" "Well, I'm keeping it." "Yes, I can see that, but how did you? How did I come back?" "Well, it's simple really. If you want something bad enough you'll get it." He turned towards the door and sighed. "It's time I tell you the news now. What I've come here to warn you about." I tapped my foot impatiently. "Well, what is it?" He began to speak, but then he paused for a moment. He looked at me, his prune-for eyes glinting. His eyes began to glare, and felt a great malevolent force emanating from him. "You know, Percy, I've been real lonely in that coffin. It's cold. The bugs crawl all over you. And it's boring lying there all the time. I've been hoping for company. You know, someone to lie with." I felt extremely uncomfortable at that moment. "Tom, I have to live my life. I'll go when I go. For now I need to stay here with my wife." No, I'm aware of that. That's the thing I'm going to warn you about. You see, I won't be lonely for long." I stood there in confusion. "What you mean?" "It's your wife, Percy. She isn't happy. Do you know what she's doing right now?" "No," I said, looking at him concerned. "She has a pistol, Percy. She's planning to kill you with it. Then collect the insurance money." "How dare you?" I said accusatively. "It's true, Percy. She would never do that." "Fine. Don't trust your friend. But don't say I didn't warn you." He got up from the couch, pieces of his hair falling on the floor. Clumps of mud joined them. He went to the door and opened it. He turned around before leaving. "See you soon," he croaked. He went out and slammed the door. I sat down angrily on my recliner. I sat there and thought a while about what he said. How could he say such a thing? My wife, the woman I had been married to for 15 years, kill me? Impossible. I looked up and saw my wife come out from the kitchen. She stopped and smiled at me. Then she drew out a gun from her pocket and cocked her head. "Percy dear, dinner is ready." Credit to Evil Carnival 77. Credit to Evil Carnival 7. My name is Dr. Miranda Solomon. Until yesterday I was a clinical research scientist for Apollyon Pharmaceuticals. I believe it is morally imperative that I warn the public about a new drug that will soon be available. Do not, under any circumstances, take citalopram, which is being marketed as an anti-anxiety medication under the trade name Calmoprax in the United States. Patients enrolled in clinical trials of this drug experienced severe side effects, including death. Worse than death, really. The animal trials were promising. So were the initial phases of human clinical trials. Of the small groups who initially took the drug, only 8% of the patients experienced side effects, all of which were very minor: headaches, nausea, the usual things that are often listed in the warnings for many medications. It wasn't until phase 3 of the trials that the side effects became troubling. The company enrolled a total 2,453 patients at 4 clinical research sites across the United States. I made frequent visits to each site in order to monitor the trials. The problem began at Site 2. A 55-year-old male began experiencing severe insomnia after taking a 100 mg dose of citalopram once daily for 6 weeks. He checked into the emergency room of the county hospital, reporting that he hadn't slept in 10 days. He was also experiencing hallucinations and psychosis related to this lack of sleep. Upon admission to the hospital, he was prescribed several different sedatives, often in combination, none of which were effective. Within 12 hours, he fell into a coma. Brain death was pronounced 5 days later, and he was removed from life support. Vital functions ceased, and a resident called the time of death. The patient's body was transported to the morgue. However, employees in the morgue reported hearing strange noises from one of the units several hours later. They opened the unit, and patient crawled out, disoriented and incoherent. This incident was captured on morgue security cameras, and I have attached the video file to this email. The patient was rushed back to the emergency room, where he became agitated, and had to be restrained. He became increasingly violent, despite multiple attempts at sedation, eventually breaking free of the restraints and injuring several hospital staff members. Hospital security officers fired a total of 8 shots at the patient, and he was pronounced dead, again. I obtained the patient's medical files, including the autopsy report. The initial cause of death was listed as undetermined, possibly related to acute insomnia. The attending physician in the emergency room added a note that the resident who first pronounced the time of death must have made an error and had been put on probation. The autopsy findings included apparent massive alterations in brain chemistry, which left the patient's body unable to produce any of the hormones required for sleep, or other normal functions. Please see the attached file, CRFO of 58469, for greater detail about this incident, including the clinical trial records, patient medical records, including autopsy report, witness statements, and photographic records of the injured hospital staff members. I presented this information to my superiors at Apollyon. Manufacture of the drug was halted, and a massive investigation began, the details of which can be found in the attached file, investigation. No adulteration, contamination, or other problems with the manufacturing process were discovered. The R&D group was unable to determine whether the drug could have caused the hormonal changes the patient experienced. The clinical trial had continued during this time, with a warning for the staff to watch for any patients reporting insomnia, and remove them from the study. Manufacturing resumed, and at one meeting I attended, the marketing VP said, "A lot of drugs cause insomnia. We'll just put it in the list of side effects." I reported this incident to the FDA, and sent my contact all of the information related to it. He agreed with the company's assessment that the incident may have been an isolated adverse reaction, and that the evidence was inconclusive to support the hypothesis that the patient's symptoms had been caused by citalopram. I received similar responses when I escalated the report to his superiors. 2 weeks later, Site 1 reported removing a patient from the study due to self-reports of insomnia. This patient was a 23-year-old female who reported 3 consecutive days without sleep. She had been taking a 50 mg dose of citalopram once daily for 4 weeks. Site 1 staff members told her to stop taking the drug, and sent her to the nearest emergency room for evaluation. She was found to be healthy, and sent home. However, the next day, her mother found her collapsed on the floor of their living room, apparently in a coma. She was transported back to the hospital, where she remained in a coma for 6 days, until she was declared brain dead. Cessation of all vital functions also ceased shortly thereafter. However, within 4 hours, she awoke, though she was incapable of coherent speech. She quickly became agitated and violent, and was restrained and moved to the psychiatric ward of the hospital. She was then removed to a maximum security psychiatric facility, where she remains. Please see the attached file, CRFO 098537 for greater detail. In total, 27 incidents were reported, each with the same presentation and clinical course. See attached files. Though this is only 1.1% of the total study population, I find it deeply disturbing. I presented my concerns to my superiors, and to the FDA, but I was told that the percentage fell within acceptable limits for risk. I disagree. If the study numbers are extrapolated, and the percentage applied to the entire population of the United States, approximately 313.9 million people, as of this writing, the projections become appalling. 3.5 million people could be affected by this drug in such a manner as I've described. Despite all of this, citalopram was approved for sale yesterday. The company has projected that it will break all of the previous sales records for anti-anxiety medications. I've presented this information to government authorities, and to all of the mainstream media outlets. My phone calls and emails have been ignored. The reporter I spoke with in person at my local Fox affiliate laughed me out of her office. You're my last hope of making this information known to the public. I hope you will post my remarks, along with the attached evidence, to your website. I have also created a video record of these remarks, which can be found at the link listed below. I doubt you'll hear from me again. I believe I'm being watched and followed by Apollyon agents. Please make sure the public knows not to take citalopram. Sincerely, Miranda Solomon, Ph.D. Clinical Research Scientist 2. Apollyon Pharmaceuticals. # This email, along with the files and video statement, was posted to an alternative news website last night, the marketing VP explained to the group of executives, after they had finished watching the video. Mostly the site is full of crazy conspiracy theories, like the president is a reptilian alien and other bullshit, but this has been getting some traction. The video version of her statement has over 100,000 views on YouTube so far. I've already got the lawyers on it, the CFO said. They're going to get YouTube to take the video down, and they're making the usual threats to the conspiracy site. But it's out there, the CEO said. People have already seen it, copied the information to other places. What are we going to do about that? Discredit her? The marketing VP suggested. What do we have on her? Does anyone even know where she is? Representatives of the company stopped by Dr. Solomon's house early this morning, the CFO said. They found her dead. Gunshot wound to the head. Self-inflicted? The CEO asked. Undetermined. They couldn't find a gun anywhere. The CEO looked around the conference table. Okay, which of you did it? The executives laughed, though no one took credit. The team left a gun there to make it look like suicide, the CFO said. The local cops are so inept that they won't look any further. Once she's discovered, we'll release some statement saying she'd been behaving erratically and was put on leave to seek counseling or something. PR, get your team started on that. The VP of Public Relations nodded. Now, the CFO continued. I have some projections regarding the effect this could have on sales. He clicked over to a PowerPoint presentation, and guided the group through several slides full of charts and graphs. In the end, I predict only a 9% revenue loss for this product in the coming fiscal year, when compared to initial projections. That decreases to 7% the following year, and so on, as people forget about all this. We will have to add coma and psychosis to the list of rare side effects, but overall, I think we should be fine, the marketing VP said. What a fucking shitstorm, the CEO said. But I guess that's all we can do. Should we have breakfast brought in? Credit to Amanda Butler brought in. Credit Our Secret Pond by Isaac Cook. The bright light of the sun flickered over us through the foliage above, as we excitedly ran along the trail that led to our secret swimming pond. Both of us had been through this path many times, so our speed didn't arouse any concern of us getting lost. Coming to the familiar fork in the trail, we stopped. The left path was longer, and through the trees we could see Boy Scouts, about our age, coming in our direction. The right path was a shorter distance to the pond, so it seemed like the obvious option. As we were about to launch into a sprint, we stopped and glared down the path. An old man came into our view, tucking an unseen object into a dark, long trench coat, hastily walked towards us. Lifting his head up from his task, he stared at us. His pace quickened. His eyes looked dark and unforgiving, with a glint to them that could drive you mad. Shooting a nervous glance at each other, a crooked smile crept up the old man's thin cheekbones. As we were both uneased by this, we quietly decided to take the longer path. We'd both rather endure a group of Boy Scouts on the small trail, than that man. Releasing ourselves from the man's gaze, as the forest was too dense to see through the divide of bush to the other trail, I felt a sense of relief. We passed the Boy Scouts, recognizing some of them from school. It wasn't as awkward as we had previously thought. Now being past the situation of the old man and the Boy Scouts, we both instantly launched ourselves into a sprint. Quickly reaching the pond, without saying a word we both stripped off our shirts, shorts and socks. Wearing only our boxers, we jumped in. The water was satisfyingly cool. I ran out of the pond and towards the rope swing, for I had never actually swung off it, but this time, I was determined to push away my fear. Firmly holding the thick rope in both hands, I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. As I opened them, I launched myself into the air, suspended by the rope. Everything felt like it was in slow motion as I let go of the rope and soared through the air. Looking down at my target area, which was the deepest part of the pond, I felt a sense of pride. I had done it perfectly, and not gone too far and into the shallower parts. All my feelings of success vanished as bubbles started to arise from the pond's depths, and a dark figure drifted to the surface amongst my target area. In a split second I made out a human body and face. Its eye sockets lay open and empty, a pale expression of pain and remorse draped on its face. I let out a sharp scream as I collided with the body. Word of this incident spread around our small town like a wildfire. The police had been at our secret pond for days trying to find evidence to pin this on someone, to no avail. The body belonged to a woman who was extremely involved within the borders of our town. Everyone was devastated. The next day, our small community took another blow. Crying families and missing persons posters littered the town, bearing 7 pictures of the boys we passed on the trail. I've told the police about the old man. That spark in his eyes is burnt into my mind. That crooked smile painfully echoes through my thoughts every time I picture it. The police sketch of the man is posted all over town as well, and no one seems to even slightly recognize him. I don't know where those boys have gone, or even if they are alive. But I do know one thing. That old man, that monster, wasn't simply just out for a walk on that horrible summer day. Credit to Isaac Cook.